hi.
All right, so if you can still hear me and see me, I'll go ahead and get started. QallOut didn't give me enough spaces to write the whole resolution, so before I get into my points, I'm going to reread the resolution in its entirety. It shouldn't change that much. We've already discussed the things that I'm going to put in it, but for the people watching at home that didn't see that discussion beforehand, I'll just say it for the sake of them. So the resolution reads: you or your spouse, so in our case, it's going to be our spouses, are sitting in a doctor's office. Your wife is pregnant. The doctor sits you down and tells you about an experimental procedure done on your pregnant wife that will allow you to choose the future profession of your child without it knowing you ever made this decision, which your child will operate very, very successfully later in life. However, there is a 1% chance of your child dying from the procedure. Resolved, undergo the procedure. Now, obviously, me being pro, I'm going to be advocating for undergoing the procedure, and Daniel being con, he's going to be advocating the opposite, that we shouldn't undergo the procedure and just let the child live its life. Now, I have three main points of analysis before I get into my main points of argumentation. The first one is how scenario resolutions work. Daniel's a pretty smart guy, but for the people watching at home that may or may not know how a scenario resolution works, I'm going to just explain it very briefly. The way a scenario resolution works is that the judge, so the people watching at home, voting to decide who wins today's debate round, is in the first person in the resolution. So you are the people that are making the decision. Pro and con are the people that are trying to persuade you in either direction. So you're the person that's trying to make the decision on whether or not to choose the procedure. We're just trying to persuade you either way. The second analysis is that the child is going to do the profession well. This is something that is outlined inside of the resolution, that regardless of which profession you choose, the child is going to operate the profession that you choose very, 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 very well. It's a lot of varies, excuse me. It's going to operate the profession very well. And then the third and final analysis is anything of your choosing. The resolution is not specifically policy. It's a scenario resolution, obviously, but it implies the pro team choosing a specific profession. Instead of me just saying, yeah, you should pick a random profession, I'm going to be advocating a specific profession for you to choose for your child to operate. Now, before I get into picking that specific profession, I'd like to present a value for today's debate round. Now, broken down very simply, a value is a weighing mechanism or a standard for both sides to determine which side of the resolution, pro or con, should be the person that wins today's debate round. And my standard for today's debate round is going to be that of quality of life. Again, quality of life. And I have a value link underneath this. Value link 1 is that quality of life contains two things. One, in order for somebody to support the value of quality of life inside of today's debate round, they have to promote a quality of life for both you and everybody else around you. So whoever can provide both of those things should be the person that wins today's debate round. So with that in mind, let's move into the profession that I'm choosing the child to pursue. And that profession is that the child should become the president of the United States. And I have two main points underneath this. The first one is that it is moving back to my second analysis, that the child will operate this profession very well, will achieve the job. So the child's going to achieve the office of the president of the United States at some point and will operate the profession very well. That means that every decision that your child makes while being president of the United States will maximize quality of life for everybody inside of the country. Not only will it maximize quality of life for your child, being the president of the United States, but because you have somebody in the office that is guaranteed to operate that position at maximum efficiency, it's going to maximize quality of life for everybody. My second point you can write down is point 2 outweighs. Again, point 2 outweighs. I'm not sure if Daniel's going to get up inside of his next speech and talk about how, the 1% may or may not kill the child, but sure, that 1% change is a little risky, but and the child may or may not die. But I'm going to take my chances knowing that there is a 99% chance of success. There's a 99% chance of us seeing the most successful president that the world has ever seen. A 99% chance that the most powerful man in the world, regardless of what decision he makes, is going to be the correct decision. And with that in mind, I'll pass the mic over to you, Dan.
A key thing to point out here would be that just because someone is going to be good at something does not mean that they themselves would naturally be meant for that thing, or that they themselves will enjoy it, or that they should be forced into doing it. I think there's a key problem that I have with this resolution, which is that it negates the child's chance to have free will. It puts you as the master of your child, forcing them to go into something for the future, which I think is, on its own, is a reason to reject this resolution. Because by what right do any of us have the ability to pre-plan someone else's life for them? My opponent will need to prove to you that we have that right and that we should enact that, even if it is a right, that we should do it. So let me respond to his points here. First, just the overall resolution that we can choose for someone else, for our child, the ability to make them be successful and become the president later on in life. I have three basic responses to the resolution. My first response is that of free will. In order to do this, you are necessarily denying free will to your child. That is an abuse of your child's mind, of their mental thought process, of their ability to live a happy and stable life of their own accord, because you have pre-planned it for them. This is a violation of their human rights and a violation of their mind. The second response is that of happiness versus success. Now, my opponent has fiated the fact that they will be a successful president. And that's okay. But my opponent has no idea whether or not his child, or any judges, because you judges are the ones who be your child, my opponent cannot say that your child will be happy being the president. Just because you'd be good at something doesn't mean you would enjoy it. For instance, I am very good at selling insurance. My dad sold insurance for 30 years. It was a thing that my family, it's kind of run in our family. My grandpa sold insurance. I sold insurance for a year and a half, and I hated it. Just because I was good at it and I made good money selling it, but I hated it. My opponent cannot fiat the fact that these kids are going to enjoy being the president. He is forcing them into a life of being the president without any knowledge whatsoever of whether or not they will enjoy it. Happiness is incredibly different than success. So he has no way of guaranteeing that this child will grow up happy. He has very likely condemned them to a life of unhappiness, which is a complete moral violation of their rights, again. And the third response I have to the resolution is that it threatens murder. By the fact that there is the 1% chance, if the action actually kills the child, that was a direct thing that legitimately killed the child. Even if you might have wanted to get something good out of it, if your action causes his or her death, you have killed them. Just because you wanted something good to happen doesn't mean you get the right to potentially kill them. That is a complete violation of the child's human rights. Everything about this case is a violation of their human rights. So he proposed the value of quality of life. Well, my first response to that value is happiness. We talked about this a moment ago. Your quality of life is not good if you aren't even happy. Just because you have a lot of success and a lot of wealth and a lot of power doesn't mean anything, which is why I will propose the counter value of human autonomy. A human body belongs to itself. A human mind belongs to itself. The standard for this round should be who is allowing individuals to have the ability to become successful and have quality of life for themselves. Not forcing them to be rich or powerful, but allowing them to become happy, rich, and powerful. Now, his point about by forcing them to be the president, that every decision the child makes will be good. Well, I have one response to this, which is that it's subjective. Good according to who? I mean, Republicans would say that everything a Republican does as a president is good. Democrats would say that everything the Democrat does as a president is good. You can't fiat your way into everything they do is good. You can't do that. All he can do is say a lot of people will like his actions, but that isn't an actual reason to prefer it in the first place. And then his second point was that it would outweigh, that the 1% chance of murder is outweighed by the utilitarian benefit. Well, this still violates the human rights of the child. On a moral level, on a level of human autonomy, first, we allow people to make decisions for themselves. So that is my basic stance in this round. We allow people to choose for themselves. Maybe the child will grow up to be president, but we need to allow that child to choose for him or herself.
Okay, I have a few basic responses to really the first argument that you made, that you're talking about how the child doesn't really have autonomy. That was really the main argument that you made inside of your last speech, that we need to let the child have free will and do what they want to do in life. And I have 4 separate responses to this, and I'll get to those in a second. But let's first respond to your response to my value of happiness. You brought up, it's not happiness, of quality of life. You responded with the value of human autonomy. I have two responses to this, and then I'll move into other responses. We'll start with the framework first. My first response is I still feel like my value of quality of life still stands. I didn't really see a response to the value link that I brought up beneath that. But even if you do, judges at home, even if you do think that human autonomy is the supported value inside of today's debate round, should be the value that we uphold to in today's debate round, I still feel like pro should win today's debate round. See, there's a key part of the resolution that Daniel is missing inside of the debate round, which is the concept that the child has no recollection and no memory of this procedure taking place. And this will be made a little bit more clear why we still achieve the value of human autonomy as I move towards the end of my speech. But that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we move forward. So now let's move into my 4 separate responses that I have to the autonomy to the autonomy point. The first is really an individual response to what right does a parent have to do this to their child, and I have 2 separate responses specifically to that inside of the 4 responses. The first one is of medical treatment. Again, medical treatment. Until the age of 16, a parent has every right to accept medical treatment or reject medical treatment or procedures for a child. You know, a couple years ago, I didn't want to get a flu shot because I thought that particular, bout of flu shots was not, was not that great. I saw a lot of research that it would cause flu instead of actually preventing it. So me and my mom compromised, and I got a flu shot because she wanted me to get a flu shot. Up until the age of 16, parents are allowed to choose what they want. The procedures that they want their child to get. My second response is that of empirics. Again, empirics. There are procedures applied to small children and babies all the time without consent. It's not like a baby has, the ability to choose whether or not they get a procedure. They're babies. They don't really have that choice. And my third response is my third response is that without the child's knowledge, and this sort of goes back to the value point that I brought up, which is that this goes back to the happiness point as well. This is sort of a group response to a lot of the responses that you brought up, which is that it's not like the child is going to not want to follow this profession. He just has a natural draw, or not he, the child, the child will have a natural draw to the profession. It's not like he's just going to blindly be like, you know what, I should be president, even though I really don't want to be president, or this is really not making me happy. It's part of his core beliefs. It's part of his core principles and what he wants to be and what he wants to follow. We have, both of us and everybody has different things that they want to pursue and different things that they want to follow in life. And we don't really know where those came from. It's going to be same for this child. The child isn't going to know where the drive and where the passion for becoming president of the United States came from. He just knows that it's there. It's not like everybody just steps aside and lets him become president of the United States. He's going to become president of the United States, through the typical means of having to campaign, going through the long, drawn-out process. He's not going to do that unless he really, really wants it. So the idea that he's not going to be happy is really not true, because it's going to be part of his core principles and core values that he wants to be on this. So that sort of responds to his free will point and his no happiness point. And I can't remember what I had for my 4th response. I'll probably bring it up at a later time. I'll remember it at some point. Then I responded to the value point, and then you brought up the example of how a good decision is subjective. And my response to this is hindsight is 20/20. Again, hindsight is 20/20. Look back at, I don't know, maybe the invasion of Iraq. That was fairly clearly not a great thing that the United States should have done. A lot of people died. We really haven't gained that much over time. So if you look at every example and every action that has been done in the past, if we look at it from a future perspective, we can see very clearly that was a bad decision or that was a good decision, in the future. So at the time, it may seem subjective, that at the time it may seem that, like, a Republican doesn't want that to happen, or a Democrat doesn't want that to happen. But in the future, if you look towards the future, there's always going to be an objective good or bad behind that decision. And I guess I'll pass that back to you. I guess I'll pass the mic back to you.
Okay. So you first talked about how there was no value link response. Well, I thought that I had responded to your value link response, but perhaps you could restate exactly what the value link was, just so I can respond to that again. But to go through the rest of the things, you talk about how you responded to the value of human autonomy by saying you were not violating the value of human autonomy because the child will have no recollection of what has been done to them. My response, that doesn't justify it. Just because a child doesn't remember what was done to it does not give you the right to abuse that child. A lot of abuse victims, for instance, do not remember the abuse that happened to them because their minds put it away. That doesn't mean you had a right to abuse them in the first place. For instance, would you have the right to rape an infant if that infant isn't going to remember it? I strongly think you would not. Would you have the right to kill an unborn baby the day before it is born? I strongly believe you do not. Just because they're not going to remember it, and just because they might not be able to fight back, doesn't give you the right to violate their human autonomy. So this is certainly not a reason to prefer his side. And now let's come to this value. The value of this round should be that of human autonomy, because this actually subsumes his value of quality of life, because you can't have a quality of life if you don't have control over your own life. So human autonomy is the most important value for this round. Especially when we factor in the fact that free will would be that which allows you to get this quality of life in the first place. So you cannot, and then to question which one of us is better upholding human autonomy, I think it's really obvious that it should be me, since I'm the only one who's actually giving free will and the opportunity to succeed to the child. Now, he responded to my point he had a few different responses to the overall point of human autonomy, just on a practical level. He talked about how parents are responsible for their children's medical treatment. Well, my response, not to violate their mind. Parents are responsible for getting their kids shots and things to keep them healthy. Parents don't just get the right to abuse their child's mind or to force their child to have certain mental thought processes. They can teach their children things. Like, for instance, if the parents want to teach their kids how great it would be if their kid was to grow up and be president, that'd be great. But if they were to take over their child's mind with these drugs and force them into this means of eventually becoming president, that is a violation which no parent has a right to do to their child. That is an abuse of the human rights and the mental rights, the human autonomy of that child. He then talked about how there were empirics that the parents can't already do this. Well, I would cross it by the same response, which is that for their health. Parents can provide drugs and things, but for the child's health, not to try and force them along a career path later on in life. You don't get a right to do that. He talked about how it wasn't without the child's knowledge. Oh, I already responded to this. Just because the child doesn't know what's going on and can't remember it doesn't mean you get a right to abuse that child. He talked about how there would be a natural draw. He was talking about the profession of president and that the child would have a natural draw toward eventually becoming president and that it would not be abusing the child's happiness. My response, natural draw does not equal happiness. I'll refer you back to my example of health insurance. I have a natural inclination to be good at sales and health insurance. My dad did it, my grandpa did it, and then I did it. But it didn't make me happy. My opponent can't fiat happiness. He can say there might be a natural inclination toward it, but that doesn't mean we would enjoy it. Just because you be good at something does not mean you will enjoy it. My second response here is that most presidents are unhappy. Even if we don't about just the regular, like the question of the resolution and just talk about the presidents themselves. I mean, look at Barack Obama. The man within 8 years went from like really good looking to great, right? And you hear the thing from any president who talks about the office. It is an extremely stressful office. You're forcing this child without allowing them to have the free will to choose for themselves. You're forcing them to choose the office of the presidency. This is a violation of their human rights, which is going to make them very likely going to make them unhappy. And my third response is that of no guarantee. Even if my opponent is right that this could lead to them being happy, that even if, I mean, there's that possibility, he can't guarantee it. So it is entirely possible that, who knows how often percent, maybe 99% of the time, maybe 50% of the time, even if it's just 1% of the time, he can't guarantee that the child is going to be happy. So even if it's just 1%, he's still guaranteed a human being a life of misery. For no right. He has no right to do this. And then his response to his point about the president will make good decisions. I said that good decisions would be subjective and that Republicans would think good decisions are one thing and Democrats would think something else. He responded that hindsight is 20/20. And my response would be that of taxes and welfare. We still debate over Reagan-era tax policies. We still debate over welfare. Just because it's hindsight doesn't mean we know what the right answers are. That's still an incredibly subjective thing. You can't say that the president will necessarily be good when everybody has a different definition of what that is. So my opponent has no ground to stand on here. He's violating the human rights of this child. First of all, because he's taking over a child's mind. Second of all, because he's guaranteeing a child the lack of free will and forcing them into a specific career path that they might not want, that just because they might have a natural inclination to doesn't mean it'll make them happy. And this is before we even factor in the fact that he very well could be killing the child. I get that it's only a 1% chance, but that doesn't justify you taking over your child's mind with a procedure that could very well kill him or her. This is a violation of human rights in every single way. On the value of quality of life or the value of human autonomy, you should vote con.
All right, so I'm just going to respond to a couple of the main lines of argumentation that you brought up. First, the response to human autonomy that you brought up. You said that it doesn't make it any better because the child has no recollection of it. My response is that it still responds to the human autonomy point, that it still responds to the human autonomy point, which is that the child is acting autonomously with a drive to a certain thing. So it's not really saying that, you know, the child is just going to hate it, but it's like a zombie or mind control forcing him to go towards something. It's just like why I have a drive towards sports or why I have a drive towards a debate. It's going to be something that is subconsciously part of his being that he's going to naturally be drawn towards. It's not like he's just going to hate it and not want to do it. It's part of his inner being. It's going to be something that he wants to achieve and something that he's going to naturally be driving for. The point of that argument wasn't necessarily to respond to, you know, a moral argument. It was to show why it was still fulfilling the value of human autonomy. And then you had three separate responses to the parental choice point that you brought up. The first response is that of natural draw does not equal happiness. Then you brought up a sub response, I guess, which is that presidents are unhappy. And then the third response is of no guarantee. And I have two separate responses that will really respond to all of these. Which is that it's not a natural draw to the talent. Like you brought up the example of you wanting, I believe it was insurance salesman. I'm not entirely sure. You brought up the example of you being drawn to an insurance salesman. It's very different. The child being drawn to this specific profession is very different than you being drawn to being an insurance salesman and him being drawn to this particular concept. The second response is that he's drawn to it to an extent that he will still want it. You know, the campaign trail is grueling, it's excruciating, but he's going to be drawn enough to it, and he's going to want it enough and enjoy it enough that he's going to still become president of the United States. You know, obviously Barack Obama was pretty unhappy in office, and a lot of presidents, you know, there's funny pictures out there before and after the presidency of the United States. All of them look as if they've aged about 20 years, but they all still wanted to become president of the United States, you know, whether it be trying to meet the greater good, they feel like they could do the job better than everyone else, or in the case of George Washington, you know, the people really wanted him to become president of the United States. There are a lot of different reasons why a person becomes president of the United States, but to assume automatically that they're going to hate it just simply based off of the fact that they are president of the United States is kind of absurd. And then in response to the medical treatment point that I brought up, that you talk about how this drug is going to be taking over the child's mind and you know, making him and really taking over his autonomy. And my response is this: how is this different than any other medical treatment? You know, there are a lot of drugs out there that affect how children behave and how their minds act, and the parents, without the child's consent, put these drugs and procedures in place without the child having any say in the matter, because that's just how things work. So how is this procedure inherently any different than a lot of other procedures out there? There are a lot of risky treatments that parents put in place on their children. There are a lot of things that parents do that affect how the child's brain operates and how the child operates as a whole, and yet it still happens. Your response to my hindsight is 2020 point is the example of taxes and welfare. You know, we're still arguing over Reagan era taxes and over a lot of things. But my response to this: but at some point there will be something that is objectively good, regardless of how much we're arguing over a specific topic, and regardless of how much we think as humans think something is objectively true. Something is true. There is always going to be an option out there that is objectively the best thing, regardless of if that's something that the community can come to an agreement on right now. Humans' brains are limited. We have no idea what is actually the best thing for everybody. But however, there is going to be something out there, regardless if we understand it or not, or even comprehend it, that is objectively the best thing. You know, this resolution is putting this child in the position what the decisions that he makes will be the most successful for himself and for everybody else. So regardless of if we as humans understand if this is that this is the objective good thing for everybody, this is objectively what's going to happen. I'm not sure if I have anything else to say. No, I think I'll pass it back to you.
So his first response to my overall value of human autonomy here was that the child will still act autonomously. Well, my response is it doesn't justify moral abuse. He even said that this point doesn't talk about morality at all. Well, I think that in his last speech, as far as I heard, I don't think he ever touched on the moral issue here, which would mean that by admission, he is agreeing that there is a moral abuse going on here, that one person is taking over the mind of another person and acting on their behalf. Now, it is entirely possible that this is a good thing. I'll let him try and defend that in a little bit here, but he is still admitting this is what is going on. We are taking over someone else's mind and pre-planning it toward a certain career path. This does violate their human autonomy on a moral level. Now, he then asked about, he said that me being naturally drawn toward insurance is different than him making a child be naturally drawn toward the presidency. Well, why? I don't know why this would be. We're literally talking about exactly that. He's saying it's a natural thing. Why would there be a natural difference in this? And my second response here is he can't fiat happiness. He hasn't ever shown you why he can fiat the happiness of this child. There's nothing in the resolution that says the child is going to be happy with this. It's just the child's going to do this. So the only way he could logically make this happen is if the child is naturally drawn toward it. But I've already shown you that just being naturally drawn toward a profession you might be good at doesn't mean you're going to enjoy it. We should let the child decide this for himself or herself. We don't force them into a profession. Even if they'd be good at the profession, we let them figure it out for themselves. The counter solution to my opponent's policy, or to his scenario, would be that the parents teach their kids how they could be good presidents. I see absolutely no reason why we would prefer this drug to the basic scenario of parental training. Especially since if we go with just having parents teach their kids how to be a good president, we respect their bodily autonomy, we respect their free will, and we don't sacrifice them to potentially being murdered. Let's talk about that. If we have them take this drug, if the mom takes this drug, there is a chance that it will kill the child. There is no reason why they must take this drug. There's no necessity for taking the drug. So it is putting the child's life at risk for no risk. There's nothing that is there to lose if they don't take this drug. So you are putting a child's life at risk just for something that you hope will eventually be an advantage. Except in order for it to be an advantage, you have to violate your child's mind in a way that would not even be better in the first place, since you can just teach the child instead. There's no advantages to this plan. There's just no way this makes anything better. Now, he talked about the office of the presidency, and he said that the campaign trail, that presidents still choose to go on the campaign trail and they can still enjoy it. Once again, you can't fiat happiness. And second of all, not all presidents are happy. He hasn't ever shown you that 100% of presidents are happy. Just because they wanted to be on the campaign trail doesn't mean they enjoyed the position. You're condemning this child to be forced to be a president because that's going to be in their mind. They don't have free will anymore. If he says that they do have free will, then they could easily choose not to be president, which would mean the resolution is false. And if he says that they will choose to be president, they have to choose to be president, then he has directly denied them free will. So he is condemning at least some of them by percentage to an unhappy position, because not all presidents are happy, and he can't guarantee that these kids would be happy. His response about taxes and welfare, he said that there are some things that are objective. Fine, some things are objective. It's still going to be subjective in a lot of ways. He can't guarantee that the kid is going to be the greatest president in the history of the world. Just that some people will like what he does. Whatever. Just because there are some good presidents, some bad presidents, does not give you the right to violate the mind of a child and potentially sentence that child to death.
let me just give a basic overview now. We have the value of human autonomy does seem to be the one that has been approved in this round, because I haven't heard anything from him recently about quality of life. And even if it was quality of life, it's subsumed by human autonomy. So which of us is better upholding human autonomy? I see absolutely no reason to prefer him on the value of autonomy, because he's directly taking away human autonomy from the person in question. So there's no reason to prefer him on the value of human autonomy. And there's no reason to prefer him on a practical level either, because by doing this, you could just as easily train the kid once he's born. You do not have to subvert their mind with these drugs when you could just let them be trained in the first place. There's no reason to prefer my opponent, especially if he's potentially killing a child. On the value of human autonomy, or even on the value of quality of life, you should vote con.
Okay, before I get into my next few lines of argumentation, I have a question for you. Why do presidents want to be president?
Usually power?
Okay, so what you're saying is that they have a reason for wanting to become president. They have a reason. They'll always have a reason. Generally speaking, it's not happiness, for wanting to get into that office, right?
Well, everybody at their heart wants to be happy, and they might think that the reason that they want power is because it'll make them happy. So yeah, I mean, sure, I'm sure they have a reason for wanting to be president.
Okay, great. Now I'll bring that up in a second, but I'll just respond to a couple lines of argumentation that you brought up. The first line of argumentation that I wrote down, there's probably a couple things before it, that I'll probably address eventually, but the first line of argumentation that you brought up was that of moral abuse, and this is sort of an all-encompassing point that I haven't really addressed. You said that I hadn't really addressed that this was, a moral abuse against the child, and my response to this is that of parental choice, and this is the reason that I brought up the parental choice point. It's my contention that it's not moral abuse, because parents have the ability to choose how their child and what medical treatments their child undergoes. Also, I brought up the point inside of my last speech that how is this any different from any other form of medication? I don't think that was responded to by you. There's a lot of medication that parents force their child to take that affect how their brain operates and affect how their body as a whole operates. But how is that any different than this medication? That's commonly accepted among most people, that it's okay for parents to choose how, what medication their child can and cannot take, because, it's fairly clear through legislation and through a lot of people's principal beliefs that a child doesn't have the mental capacity to accept or reject things that, an adult, on the other hand, would have the mental capacity to accept or reject, which is why adults make decisions for children. So I'd ask that you respond to that point, and that's really the reason why it's not a moral abuse, because parents have the ability to choose what and what not their child does and does not take. In response to you had two responses to my responses to your natural law does not equal happiness point. Basically, both of them boil down to how you cannot fiat happiness. The resolution says nothing about the child being happy. You can't fiat this. And I have two separate responses to this point. The first response, and don't kill me for saying this, it'll hopefully be made a little bit more clear as I move on, but happiness isn't overly important. Again, happiness isn't overly important. I have a feeling I'm going to get lynched in the street for saying this, but hear me out for a second. Every president, I'm sure both of us can agree that most presidents were wildly unhappy with performing their job. It's not a very fun job. It's incredibly stressful. You have the weight of literally the entire free world on your shoulders. However, in this circumstance, and through the circumstance of every president running for office, they always have a reason for wanting to have that office, whether it be, they feel they can do the job better than everyone else, whether it be they want power, whether it be, they feel like the American people really need them at that time, or in the case of a lot of other presidents, the American people just really wanted them in office so they conceded to run again. So he can talk all he wants about how, this child may or may not be happy, but what we do know is that the child is going to have a reason that is going to be compelling and driving enough to drive him to become president of the United States. So happiness isn't overly important in this situation, but what we do know is that the child is going to be content with this situation because he has something that is driving and compelling enough to push him to do one of the most stressful things that you can probably do, which is running for president of the United States and being president of the United States. My second response to this can't fiant happiness point is really ties into the first one, which is that the child will not understand that the procedure has been that the procedure has taken place. The child will assume the role that he has free will over his actions, that he has the ability to think as he wants, but that he chooses to run for president and do all of these things. So it's really not like the child is, like I've said earlier, it's not like the child is walking around like a robot without making a choice. He's making the decision because inside of his natural tendencies, he has a tendency to strive after the presidency of the United States for whatever reason he wants to run for presidency of the United States. And then I'll respond to your counter standard that you brought up of parental training. And I really have two separate responses to this. The first one is that of no guarantee. Again, no guarantee. There's no guarantee that this child will actually end up being president of the United States. And in fact, most of the time, if my mom were to come up to me and from my birth be like, you know what, we're just going to go over everything in politics and teach you how to be president of the United States, more than likely, I'm probably not going to be president of the United States. There have only been 45 out of how many billions of people? More than likely, this is not going to happen. There's no guarantee of this happening. With the passage of the with a pro ballot, there is a guarantee that this will happen. And then I guess my second response sort of ties into the next one, which is that the child will be equally unhappy in this situation because his parents are going to be pressuring him to run for president and be in politics, even if the child doesn't have a tendency to follow this. See, what happens with the pro plan is that the child does have a tendency to fall into politics. With the counter standard, you have no idea if the child is actually going to want to be in politics. All that we know is that the parents are going to be constantly pressuring him to, enter the political arena. That's probably pretty draining on the kid. So, not sure if I have anything else left to say. Yeah, we can go ahead and pass the mic back to you.
Okay, so the first thing I'd like to point out is that I believe that we have both at this point agreed that there is a potential that this is going to murder someone. So we have the potential for murdering someone contrasted, and the fact that we will be taking away their mental autonomy, contrasted against the utilitarian idea that they'll be president, and that's better. Well, my opponent still hasn't weighed how that in any way would be a preferable outcome. So let me now go through the responses that he has here. First, he talks about how moral abuse is not actually moral abuse because the parents are making the choice. Oh, well, that's still moral abuse. Just because a parent chooses to morally abuse their child doesn't mean they get the right to do it. They don't have the ability, or my response here, I guess if you want to tag it, would be not 100%. Parents don't have 100% authority over their children. They can't rape their child. They can't beat their child. They can't do any of these abuses of their child because the child still has bodily autonomy. It is a human person. The parent can't just do whatever they want. So in this situation, the parent does not have the authority to take over the mind of their child and force them into a career that we have no clue if they would want it or not. This would be violating the bodily autonomy with something that the parent does not have a right to do. Now, he talked about how there were different medications that parents already prescribed to kids and that they do have a right to do that. My response, for health. Parents have the right to protect the health of their children. It's for the purpose of protecting their child. And they can prescribe them medications and that sort of thing, such as vaccines and that sort of thing, because it protects the health of the child. But there is no such justification for this resolution where the only reason you would do this is because the parent wants a utilitarian outcome sometime in the future, so they hijack their child's mind. There's no comparison between having them take a flu bug like a vaccine versus taking over their mind and forcing them to choose a profession a long time in the future. No comparison whatsoever. This is a moral abuse of the child. Clear reason to vote for the con. I'd also like to point out the value has not been addressed recently, so we are judging this off of the value of moral autonomy. Which of us better provides for moral autonomy? And on a level of morality, which of us is being more moral? And I don't see any reason to prefer my opponent in that. When we talk about autonomy, clearly that goes con. When we talk about the overall question of morality, that also goes con. Now, he talked about how happiness isn't important, and he said, quote, most presidents are wildly unhappy. Couple of responses. First response is that of exactly? Yeah, most presidents are wildly unhappy, and you as a parent are forcing your child to choose something that is going to make them wildly unhappy. Even those presidents who had free will to choose this still wound up wildly unhappy. What do you think it's going to lead to when you force them to naturally choose this? You're going to make your child wildly unhappy. This is a clear violation of your child and just no reason to prefer it on a moral or bodily autonomy level. My second response is that of cruel parenting. I mean, even if the child doesn't know what's going on, the parents sure as hell know what's going on. They know that every time they see their kid like fighting and like, oh, mom, this is exhausting me. This campaign trail, it's killing me inside. And mom's going, well, I knew that was going to happen, and I made you do it. That's terrible as a parent. That's just awful parenting. And then you talked about how the child won't understand. Well, we respond the same way. Parent will know. The parent knows what's going on. They know what they did to their kid. This is a clear violation. Now, with regards to the parental training, he had two responses. He first said there was no guarantee, and he said the child would be equally unhappy. The first point of that of no guarantee is that it's still preferable. My response is preferable. Just because there's no guarantee the kid will be president, that doesn't matter. The kid has free will to choose if they want to be president. That's a preferable outcome. It doesn't matter if the kid must be president. If they have the choice to choose if they're going to be president, that is a preferable outcome. And then with the child being equally unhappy, my response will be still their choice. The child has the choice and the ability to back out of being president if you just let the parent teach the kid about how eventually sometime down the road they should try and be president. That gives the child the choice to be able to choose this. And so to summarize, and then I'll give the final word to my opponent, but to summarize this round, my opponent already agrees with the fact that his plan risks murder of a child. That in and of itself is a reason to prefer the con. My opponent already agrees that the value for this round is that of bodily autonomy. There is no reason to prefer him on the question of bodily autonomy. There's nothing about his case that is better from a bodily autonomy perspective than the con. No reason to prefer him on that. There is no reason to prefer my opponent except for this utilitarian idea that we'll get a good president sometime in the future. There's just no reason to prefer him at all. So on every level in this round, from a moral perspective, from the perspective of not killing people, from the perspective of good parenting, from any perspective, the con is winning. And I would urge a vote for the con.
All right, so for today's debate round last speech, I'm just going to be bringing up three main voting issues, or three things that kind of boil the round down into 3 points, or 3 reasons why I think you should vote pro. The first voting issue you can write down is parental choice. Again, parental choice. And this has been talked about briefly by both, actually, in depth by both debaters. The reason this is not really a moral abuse is because, in medicine, the parents have the ability to make a decision for their child when the child cannot, obviously speak for itself. I brought up the example, how is this different than any other treatment that affects the child's brain? He talked about the flu shot. I wouldn't compare the flu shot, but there are plenty of other treatments out there that affect children's brains, and yet the parents do it anyways. So from an empirical example of all the millions of parents that have forced medical treatment upon their children, this is something that is not really amoral. Nobody in legislation or in judicial rulings has said that this is something that parents can't do. In fact, it's the exact opposite. People have said that parents are allowed to make decisions for their children because their children are not mentally capable of making the decisions for themselves. The second voting issue is that of natural drive. Again, natural drive. It's not as if this child is just, going to be walking around and just hating everything about what he does. That's not reasonable to assume. He's going to have a natural tendency to want to follow this. And if he has a natural tendency to follow it, there's really no reason to assume that he's going to, hate every aspect of it. There is going to be something that draws him to it. There's going to be something about it that he likes enough to draw him towards it. So it's unreasonable to assume that he's going to, hate everything about what he's doing and hate everything about becoming president of the United States. There's going to be something that draws him towards that. My third and final voting issue is the most important one. And you can write this down as Make America Great Again. With the passage of the PRO plan, we have the potential to get the greatest president that the world has ever seen. Somebody who's, regardless of what decision they make, will always be the right decision. Somebody that has been trained from birth to become the best president that the known world has ever seen. sort of superhero-esque. He's going to be the best president that we've ever seen. So if you want to make America great again and make America the strongest country in the history of every civilized nation, make this kid the president. He can literally do no wrong. He's going to be the best president that the world has ever seen.
That's
So with that in mind.
That's inherent.
What?
We already have that. We already have a president who has made
yeah.
the greatest country in the world.
Yeah. No, actually, vote for Donald Trump. Don't vote for Trump.